Hello, everyone. Welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on Financial Edge AP Payments, Voids, and Corrections. Today we have Chuck Hayes, the Director of Application Services here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat that will be located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go over all the questions at the end. Thank you, and I'll now hand over the hosting to Chuck.
Hello, everyone. This is Chuck Hayes. I'm the Director of Application Services here at Zobrio. And let me go ahead and share my screen, see if I can take control of everything. Just 1 second here. And I just need to take a moment to get a couple things set up on my end. Just bear with me here. Okay, now I think I'm ready to go. So today we want to talk about this very thorny issue known of as voids and corrections associated with voids. It can send shivers up the spine of any accountant. So we want to look at 3 different aspects of this issue, and we're going to focus on accounts payable. Honestly, the same techniques apply to other modules as well. But so what exactly is the impact of voiding on records? And what about voiding payments? Like, how is that done? And, other related transactions. And then what if I need to reissue a payment, whether it's reprinting something, like the checks got mangled if you're printing checks, or just I need to reuse a check number or something like that. So let's take a look at just some specifics that we'll be talking about. So when it comes to the impact of voiding on records, we're going to talk about some accounting issues and then posting considerations. When it comes to voiding payments, believe it or not, there's a really important set of user options that totally impacts everything. And then there are also posting implications and also how you do the posting. And then when it comes to reissuing payments, and I'm trying to be as general with that as possible, everything from reprinting to starting over and reusing a number and all that stuff, there are some business rules and potentially bank settings that come into play. So let's kind of take each of these individually. I'll be using my copy of the Black Blood Sample Database, and I've got some older records. I created a few new ones, so we'll just kind of go through the whole process. So first of all, this issue of accounting. So one of the most common, I'll call it questions, but it's really more of a, I can't believe this happened statement posed as a question, is when someone does a void in the organization and it reaches back 7 periods and uses a post date that everyone thought was no longer in use. So let's just be specific. So this is June, okay? So what if I did a void and all of a sudden, like without anything else ever showing up in front of me, I suddenly found out that this void went to the general ledger back in February, and I thought it was going to be dated in June. Well, that's actually in our second section. So the first decision you need to make from an accounting standpoint is, what are your rules from an accounting perspective for the date of a void? Because when you void a payment in accounts payable, you will be creating reversal records that will go to the general ledger when you post, and they will have their own separate posting date. And there is a way that you can completely control that. There are also some ways you could restrict what could be possible, but you need to first make an accounting decision about what you want. And then I would recommend that you inform everyone in your organization about what the rules are, because it can vary depending on the circumstances. If it's the current period, maybe that's fine. But if it was last month, well, maybe yes, maybe no, that's okay. But 3 months ago is absolutely not appropriate. You have to decide that piece. So once you've made the decision from a policy standpoint of voiding, then we'll talk in the second section about, well, how do you make sure that everyone who's allowed to void has settings in place that make sure they conform to your policy. The second piece I want to bring up is this issue of voiding impact on records. So I'm going to go here into accounts payable, and I'm just going to pull up an example and talk about some what ifs. So this happens to be a more recent invoice that I created. And you'll notice on the right-hand side of this invoice that, and I know I'm looking at invoice, not a payment, but the same rules apply. I've got a post status of posted, okay? Well, what if this were not posted? So the thing to keep in mind is that when you, and the word void is used for payments, the word delete, which I'm not a big fan of, but the word delete is used for other transaction records like an invoice. So the big issue becomes, well, was this record originally posted to the general ledger? Because if the item has not been posted to the general ledger and you void the payment, it just goes away. And if the invoice has not been posted and you delete the invoice as part of that process, it just disappears because it has not been posted to the general ledger and there's no reversal impact going on. So that's a big consideration around your business procedures as far as, well, if I did issue payments and I want a record of what happened before they voided, then it's probably a good idea to go ahead and post. And we'll talk about a different variation of the posting situation, but just keep in mind that reversals are only created when the original transactions have been posted to the general ledger. So I want to make sure I talked about that specific issue. So let's move into the second piece, which is really the heart of the matter about voiding payments and their related transactions. And the first thing I want to point out is a user option. Now, personally, I wish this were a business rule so you could impose it on everybody, but it's not. So every user, every login, every person who can log into the Financial Edge or FENXT, those individual users need to make changes to their user options. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. So first of all, you need to be in accounts payable for this example. And user options, as you probably recall, are located in the Tools menu at the top of the shell under Options. And what we want to focus on is the Records tab. So first of all, I'm going to go down the left-hand side, and I want to take a look at Invoice Activity. And you will notice down at the bottom, it's actually in the middle on the right, but the end of these drop-down options, there's an option called Default Reversal Post Date. So what normally happens when you go to delete an invoice that's already been posted? Well, the normal, I should say the normal starting point in this system when you first create a user is set to today. But I recommend that you consider setting it to blank because this will force you to put in a date when you go through the process. And I'm a big fan of that because then that way you can ensure that everyone is conforming to your policy. So default reversal post date blank, I recommend. That's under invoice activity. Now the same thing applies to credit memos, and I'm really focused on invoices, but there is a reversal date setting for credit memos as well. And then under payments, there's a default void date. So what is the date of the void? But then there's the reversal that goes to the general ledger. And off the top of my head, I may be wrong about this because I think it actually defaults the original payment post date for the reversal. So you just want to make sure that all of these are set to blank. So again, it's invoice activity and credit memo activity and payment. The default void dates or reversal dates, I recommend being set to blank. And then you'll see how that comes into play when we actually try to void something. And then there's a minor related setting that isn't about dates, but I do like to point it out while I'm here. So when you're looking at invoice activity on the activity tab of the vendor record, there is a setting under vendor activity to show deleted transactions, but that way you'll be able to see an invoice. Again, it has to have originally been posted, but if you have an invoice that was posted and then you delete it, it still will be visible in the grid. It's just that it'll have a status of deleted, but it won't impact the overall balance that you owe the vendor. So I thought I would point that out as a related setting. So now let's move into this issue of, well, how do I go about actually voiding a payment? Now, there are several ways to get to the payment. So I'm going to show you two different ways to get there. And it's really up to you what you think is most convenient, depending on what you know at the time. So if I go back into DL landscaping for a moment, you'll see that I've got an April invoice here that's paid. And I can open the invoice and go to the Payments and Credits tab, and I'll see the payment listed. And I can open the payment from that tab, and you'll notice at the top there's a void button. Okay, so I can go from the invoice or from the vendor to the invoice and then to the Payments tab and open the payment. The other choice I have is to go to the bank register. So in banks, once you locate the bank at the top that represents where the check was originally, or the payment was originally created, then I can click Open Register. And I also have access to this DL landscaping payment that I just showed you a moment ago. Now, I personally prefer to start with the bank register. It's more about, I don't like to have a lot of records open when I'm voiding something, because you just want to take the chance that, well, I just did that, and did it affect the record I've opened? So let's just work with one record at a time. But what you will see is that regardless of how you get here, you are going to be presented with two choices. You'll have the ability to void the payment, but you'll also have the additional ability, whether you choose to use it or not, you have the additional ability to delete the underlying invoice. Now, of course, that is a whole other conversation, and I'll just mention a few issues in just a moment. Okay, so I'm looking at the payment. I'll use the void button at the top. We also have in the payment menu the option to void. And let's take a look at what's in front of us. So first of all, you'll notice that I have blank void dates and reversal dates. Again, my personal preference, because I'm being forced to conform to the policies of the organization, or at least make a thoughtful decision. So I get to decide what makes sense for my void date. Let's say I want to use today. And again, if that's your normal rule, you could change the user settings accordingly. I just like to point out that this blank option. So the top section is really all that's involved in voiding the payment itself. The bottom section gives me the option to also delete the invoice, but that's a whole different level of consideration. So for example, okay, maybe the check was never received and I need to reissue the check. Well, in that case, I still owe the money, so I don't want to delete the invoice. Or maybe we found out that we had double paid, like this invoice had gone in twice accidentally and we paid both. In that case, I would want to delete the invoice. Or some other scenario along those lines. So you can do both at the same time. Now notice, if I check the box to delete the invoice down in the bottom section and I scroll to the right, there is a reverse on field that I will need to complete. And in fact, because I set my user options to blank, I will have to do something with this field before the system will allow me to actually delete the invoice. So I could go ahead and reverse it as of today, or I could use the original invoice date. That's basically an accounting decision. Okay, so once I make that decision, then I'm good to go as far as completing the process. Now in my case, I don't want to delete this because I'm going to show you how you can do repayments. All right, so I've got this payment. I'm just going to write down that payment number just for a moment. So 6592-7592. So I can go ahead and void the payment. So let's go ahead and do that and then see what else is going on. You notice that purge is grayed out here, but I'll show you how to get to that in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and void. Now then we'll get the warning. This check is about to be voided. Are you sure you want to continue? Then everyone looks around nervously and asks the question, should I? And then we say, yes, we will. So now that I've voided the payment, you'll notice in the status bar at the bottom of the payment, it shows that the payment has been voided. And if I look at the bank register in the status column, I will also see that the payment has been voided. Now let's take a look at the invoice that was part of this payment. I'm going to go back to records, and I believe I have the vendor open now that no, I did close it. Okay. So back on the activity tab, the invoice is now unpaid because I voided the payment associated. So the voiding of the payment also unapplies the payment, which happens normally in the background. So now that invoice needs to be paid. So that brings up another consideration. So if I'm going to reissue this payment, chances are, I mean, in most circumstances, I would just run it through the normal check printing process and use the most recent number, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just vary the scenario slightly. Let's say that, okay, they never received it. We want to reissue it with I know that's not a good example, but let's say I need to reissue this payment with the same check number, because that does happen sometimes, perhaps in real time. You know, I had a situation where, you know, something went wrong. I said, okay, wait a minute, I need to reissue and use this number. Well, the only way I can reuse a check number is if I also purge the payment. Now this, I'm only letting you know functionally what's possible. It's not my job to tell you what you should or should not do. Most organizations prefer to have the trail in the bank register, and so they don't necessarily want to purge, and there's a security setting that can prevent that. But if you do want to purge the payment for whatever reason, then usually you have to end up, once you've voided, then you go into back to bank, select the correct bank, and on the right-hand side under administrative tasks, you'll see purge voided transaction. So once the payment has been voided, this is a computer check, and I can void it by payment number 67592. Okay, 67592. I can use the same number in both. And I can do a control report just to let me know what I did, but go ahead and purge. Are you sure? Okay, so I did something wrong with my range. So that was my, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't do the post report. So, you know, you'd think I'd remember this. I need to post the entry first before I can go ahead and purge because of the reversal process. So let me skip over to that. But I will mention, so once you've done the posting, which was my mistake for not doing that next, like my note said, but you can go ahead and void the transaction. And then if you wanted to, you could temporarily set the bank register under edit account details payment. You could temporarily set the next number to match that 67592 that I had now is available again. So again, if I go back in the numbering scheme and I purge an old number, it does become available. The system doesn't automatically reset the next number. You can manually go back to that and then put it back, put this setting back to what should be the real next number. So I just wanted to point out that little consideration about how you can go back in time, assuming you've purged the payment. But you do have to post first, which again, I did not do. But I do want to talk about that. So when it comes to this issue of voiding payments, I mentioned here in the outline that there's an issue around posting, and that is what I wanted to get to. I just decided to do I went out of sequence here and did the purging thing before I did that. So when you void a posted payment, you are going to create reversals, and they need to go to the general ledger through the posting process. Well, I've run into some questions around that before, because typically what I would recommend, you know, if you want the reversals to just post with everything else, okay, fine, just include them, which is what I've got going on here. But you could isolate them by first going ahead and posting what was there, and then going through the voiding process, and then looking at what's available. But the reason I bring this up in particular is because I've had folks ask me, hey, we voided some posted payments and they didn't show up when we went to post. So my first question always is, do you have any filters in place? Because depending on what dates you used for the reversals, if you're used to using dates for posting, which I personally am not a big fan of, I understand when it's needed, but I normally would not want to do that. If you're using any dates for posting that restrict it, and let's say, okay, obviously I did mine dated today, but what if I had a date filter for yesterday? If I did that, then this post file would not find the reversals because they're dated today. So it's always a good idea, if you ever run into a situation where you're not seeing something you're expecting for posting, if nothing else, start a brand new post file, make sure there are no filters in place, and then go to validate. Now, what I should be seeing are some invoices that I intentionally did not post, but then I'll see the reversals. So let me magnify this just a little bit. And you'll see the last two rows, reversal of that payment that I voided a little while ago. And that is dated today. So if I had used a different date than today, say an older date for posting, or a different date when I did the transaction and I posted as of today, I could run the risk of not including the reversal. And I've had customers before that were always using dates. They thought they were correctly picking up everything. Turns out they weren't. And there were a lot of activity that wasn't going to the general ledger. So if nothing else, just start a new file, post file, make sure there are no filters, and check to see under validation what's out there. But the reversals should show up. And if you did delete the invoice, then that will show up. The reversals also will show up, and then they'll go over to the general ledger when you post. Okay. Now, once you've posted, then you could go back and purge the voided transactions with the option that I showed you a little while ago. And then if you wanted to fool around with the numbering of the payments, you could, which is kind of what I'm talking about in the second section, but I've got one more thing to point out. In this last section, reissuing payments, I was focusing on, well, what if I wanted to purge and reissue a number that I just purged? So that was what I showed you, a little bit out of sequence here. But there's a whole other issue, and that's the one around I'm printing the checks, okay, and okay, the printer messed up, like for a lot of different reasons. Either we had check stock we forgot to put in, or the printer mangled it, or something like that. So what if I am in the process of printing payments, printing checks in this case, I should say, and I need to reprint them. So the payments are there, everything's okay, but everything went wrong with my printer, or I didn't put in the paper, or I need to start over again. Okay, so if I'm gonna reissue existing payments that I just printed, so basically, technically, I'm reprinting checks, there's a specific business rule you have to enable, and then you have to capture the process, but only at one point in time. So let me walk you through that particular scenario. So first of all, I need to check a business rule in configuration. So configuration, business rules, and there's a payment business rule. It's the second checkbox from the top. Allow check printing to be restarted, and only once when you're ready to print. That's the only time that you can do it. Okay, so allow check printing to be restarted. Once this business rule is in place, you may have to log off and log back in, but once that's in place, then you will have the option after you print the checks to reprint them. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to go into print checks and record bank drafts. I'm just going to focus on a few of these older invoices I've got here just ready to help me out with this example. So I'll just pick a few of them. Oh, let me pick one more here. I'll go ahead and create them. And I've got a PDF printer that's going to come up in just a moment to show the payments. I won't bother putting on the screen here, but you will see that flash up in just a moment. So I get to the verification. Okay, I want to print 3 checks. Let's say I go ahead then. I think everything's okay with my printer. I create the payment, which also then sends the information to my printer. So I'm just going to go ahead and let me just stick this in my downloads folder. We'll replace that file. Okay, so that showed up on another monitor. I don't need to bore you with a PDF view, but here's the important setting. So the system has sent the commands to the printer. You discover there's a problem, and oh no, the paper is not there. I need to put the right paper in, or something like that. This is your one and only chance to reprint using the same payment numbers without having to go through a void process. So first of all, I recommend to everyone, do not just breeze past this prompt. Oh, I know it'll print fine, I'll just click OK. No, wait until you've seen the checks and make sure they're okay before you click OK. Because what I can do is uncheck the successful checkbox, and in the lower left, I will now have an option to reprint the checks. And I can be selective, but I do have to do ranges. It's not as if I kind of will get this prompt again, but you got to be careful about the ranges. So just make sure you pick the right numbers that you're reprinting, and only those payments. If it's everything, that's fine. In this case, I could reprint everything. Okay. So again, wait until the checks print or not print, that you see if you have a problem, then uncheck the successful checkbox and select reprint and choose the right numbers that make sense. and then the system will go ahead and send that information back to the printer all over again. Otherwise, if you don't capture the setting here, you will have to void everything. All right, so I'll just go back to successful. Okay, so just to recap, these sticky things known as voids, sticky issues. First of all, if I void or delete a transaction that has been posted, it just kind of goes away. So that's a consideration. You need to decide from an accounting standpoint what your rules are for the dates of void. When it comes to actually doing the process of voiding, make sure everyone's user options have been thoughtfully considered, preferably to use blank date settings. So everyone has to review the settings and intentionally put in the appropriate date. And then go ahead and make sure you post everything so that you get all the reversals and make sure they're showing up on the post report, and make sure your settings are in place that aren't getting in the way of that. And then if you do need to reprint the payments, make sure you're careful about, the business rule will allow it, and then make sure you're careful about that process when you're actually printing the checks. Wait until everything prints, then review them. And then if you need to, uncheck that successful checkbox. And if you need to reprint, or I should say reissue a payment that you had voided and purged, you may have to go into the bank settings and modify the check number after purging to go back in time for what is now an available check number, and then reset that particular check number. So that pretty much concludes most of the I should say 99% of the considerations around voiding payments and the associated corrections in accounts payable. But I want to make sure we leave some time here that you can use the chat window if you want to go ahead and type in a question, and then I'll be happy to answer those. So I'm going to go ahead and continue my sharing just for a little bit in case any questions come up that I'll be ready to answer. So again, thanks everyone for coming today. But in the meantime, we'll hang around a bit and answer any questions you might have.
Does anyone have any questions? Alrighty, thank you everyone for joining us. A recording of this webinar will be available shortly. Thank you.
Thanks.